Welcome to Workin It Out, a podcast from Porchlight about the things that affect the rural workforce. My name is Burke Ermintrout, and I'm the Director of Policy and Communities here at Porchlight. My conversation today is with Andrew Button, the founder and CEO of Mashup Lab, an organization that works to connect rural entrepreneurs to resources for businesses, but do it in a way that sounds a lot more interesting than the way I just said. Today, Andrew and I talk about the ways that you can intentionally build community in rural communities, how that affects entrepreneurship, the amazing ways that he is connecting rural entrepreneurs, and even those who might not realize yet that they're rural entrepreneurs, to business resources, and so much more. Tune in for a great conversation. Andrew Button, welcome to Working It Out.
Hey,
good to have you
great
here.
to be with you, Burke.
Thanks for being here. So, Andrew, you do a lot of really cool stuff. So I thought we'd just jump straight into one of the really cool things you do, and then we'll circle back and talk a little bit about your background and how you got here. But to start, I want to talk about Awesome South Shore. Can you just tell me what this is? What's the elevator pitch?
Yeah, so I actually found out about the Awesome Foundation. That actually isn't a foundation at all.
Okay.
Started by a couple of guys in Boston, actually, that they were sitting on various like not-for-profit boards and lots of like community initiatives, and saw how challenging it was for these organizations to get just a little bit of cash to do the awesome thing that they wanted to do. And they said, well, what would it look like if we just threw $1,000 up, up for grabs, and got people to pitch us on awesome ideas and see what shows up. And that's really where it started. I heard about it. And so this has been a bit of a global sort of phenomenon. I heard about it from a couple of friends in our biggest city here in Nova Scotia, Halifax, and they were like, "Hey, we're doing this thing. We give away $1,000 for people to want to do awesome stuff." And that was great. And they were telling me about all the awesome things that they were doing. And I was driving home about an hour or so from Halifax to where I'm sitting here today. And as I drove, I'm like, the South Shore of Nova Scotia, like my community is just as awesome as Halifax or any of these other big cities. Like I can't help to believe we can figure out a way to make this happen here. And that was in 2014. I launched Awesome South Shore, Mashup Lab, and a bunch of other things, all in about a 3-month period. And we've been having a ton of fun with it ever since. So the pitch is, we give away $1,000 cash, no strings attached, to people that want to do awesome stuff in our community. And sometimes that's $1,000 worth of dirt for a local community garden, $1,000 worth of really intricate, unique perfume bottles to help a new entrepreneur get started with an all natural perfume that they were making. And sometimes it's $1,000 for a Twitter bubble machine where you tweet at it and it shoots bubbles at the side, and it just makes people happy and brings joy to the community. So we have a ton of fun with it.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Those are some great examples of what it's kind of funded. So what does the process look like for people to get from here to there? I think it's kind of like a pitch night, right?
Yeah, it's super simple. We try to keep it really light and friendly, and the essence of the $1,000 comes from 10 people that show up with $100 each to make $1,000 pot. And we have a website that people go through over the course of the month to sort of, hey, here's how I would spend that $1,000. And we invite usually anywhere from 3 to 6 of those folks that strike a chord with us to come and share their idea in 4 minutes, and they get to tell a bit of their story. And then at the end of the night, they walk away with $1,000 cash to go make that awesome thing happen. And it is as simple as that. And I think that's really the spirit of it, Burke, is that it's super lightweight. There are no board meetings, there are no articles of incorporations. There's not even a bank account, right? Like there's just the simple notion of, we know there are awesome ideas out there. Can we put a little bit of seed funding in place to help somebody go make that happen? And sometimes they're like community endeavors, but more often than not, we're finding is that it's people that have ideas for new businesses, and $1,000 is the thing that gets them started. And we see all kinds of really cool things happening in our community as a result of it. So yeah, the process is pretty simple. Just pitch your idea, come and share it in 4 minutes, and walk away with $1,000 to go make it happen.
That's really cool. I love the simplicity of the idea. It's easy to understand. Okay, this is what's happening. This is how I get involved, everything with that. But also, I think it's just a really powerful idea for people to say, okay, I have this, thing I want to do, and here's a way that know I can try and find some funding, and I'm going to get a fair shot
Yeah.
to try that out. I'm curious, for your perspective on what it's meant for the community to have something like this. Like, what's kind of the impact been in the community for folks?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, I think there's just a lot of really great initiatives that are already on underway, and it's really hard for them to find just that little bit of money to do a certain thing. Like, it doesn't meet the funding criteria for lots of stuff, and the process to go and get $1,000 to go do this thing is sometimes not really worth it, and it really gives this alternative of like a super lightweight way of getting it just a little bit of cash to go and experiment with something. So I think that's really been a good supplement to more formal organizations in our community that are trying to move really important big things forward, for our community. But from my perspective, I think like the bigger impact is what happens when somebody that isn't associated with an organization, they're just a person with an idea that's passionate about making something happen. What happens for them, Burke, when somebody in their community, it's 10 people, say, we believe in you and we're going to trust you to put this $1,000 to good work. Sometimes that's the first time in that person's life that anybody's ever believed in them, and the reaction that they get as a result of that is, that's the most awesome part about it. Their confidence goes through the roof. The things that they go on to do with just our little bit of cash and that sort of pat on the back and say, hey, you're doing something good, I think is really sometimes the impact that doesn't often get measured but is impossible to ignore when you feel it. And I think that's for me, the biggest part. And we see a lot of the same things in our co-working space with Work Evolved, and a lot of the stuff that we do with Mashup Lab. That same theme kind of comes through in all of the stuff I end up putting my fingers into.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to talk about Work Evolved and Mashup Lab. We're going to dive into those and let people know what those are and what they do. But I wanted to start with Awesome South Shore just because of the clarity of the idea. And yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's so true what you're saying about so often, I mean, at the $1,000 funding level, especially, on the one hand, sometimes it doesn't seem like a lot of money, but also, I mean, that can be a whole project. But putting that funding together, especially, if you don't have the resources or you're just getting started, I mean, often that first $1,000 is the hardest $1,000 in a project like
totally.
that, just to
Or
to
the
get
last
moving.
thousand
And
dollars, right?
yes,
Like
yeah,
sometimes
exactly.
they're like, hey, we got a $10,000 project. We've been able to exhaust all of the other avenues, and we're like $1,000 short. Like that's all we need to make
Yep.
this thing happen. So we've been both the first thousand and the last thousand to kind of get something going.
Oh, that's awesome. And yeah, that's great to be able to fill that gap and uh, make that happen. So that's fantastic. Well, hopefully that gives people a little bit of sense of the type of stuff that you do and the way you're trying to make an impact in the community. But one of the things we love to do at Working It Out is, rural communities are all distinct and unique, and people love them for the things that they are. And so I would love to hear a little bit about your rural community. Where you live, what you love about it, the people, the geography, what makes it unique. Yeah, what is? I know you're in Nova Scotia. What is it like there?
Yeah, it is a beautiful place, and of course I'm biased, right? This is where I've spent the majority of my life now. So I grew up in sort of the most easterly province in Canada, in Newfoundland, in a small town there, and then met a girl from small town Nova Scotia, and this is where we've sort of set up our lives here on the South Shore, which is about an hour away from Halifax. And I think the thing that I love most about this particular place is, like, in 15 minutes, I can be running on some of the most beautiful beaches, next to the Atlantic Ocean with my dog. An hour in another direction, I'm in downtown Halifax, enjoying a cold beverage on the waterfront and getting that sort of, city vibe. In another 15 minutes, I can be at the international airport and fly anywhere in the world that I need to get to in a couple of flights. Um, and the diversity of things that we have in such a really like we're a relatively small province of 1 million people, 500,000 of which live in Halifax, and then the other 500,000 are scattered like matchsticks across the countryside. But even in that sort of small geography, we have some really distinct regions. Like this region here on the South Shore is, next to the Atlantic Ocean, so you get that sort of ocean vibe, beaches, those sorts of things. You go a little bit inland, some of the most beautiful lakes and hiking trails and cycling trails. On the other side of our province, the Annapolis Valley is where a lot of our agriculture happens, and there's a whole wine scene and culture scene that comes along with that. You get to Cape Breton Island, right? It's an island that's a part of the province. So you got to go across the causeway to get there, and the Cape Breton Highlands is some of the most beautiful scenery on the East Coast you have to find there, and this is all in our backyard, and so accessible to us, and I just feel really blessed to be able to call this place home. And as much as I appreciate all the other rural places I get to see, Burke, and they all, as you say, have something really sort of special and unique and interesting about them. Whether it's rural Oklahoma or rural South Dakota or rural Alberta or rural Nova Scotia. Um, there's something about landed back home and being in this place that just kind of lights up my spirit. So I think most people feel that with the place that they've chosen to call home.
Yeah, I think that's true of, for everyone in a rural community. Every rural community is great, but mine's the best because it's where I am
Yeah.
and it's where I know, and the things that make that special. So just to kind of help people conceptualize as we're talking through the conversation, how big is your community just kind of from a population perspective?
Yeah, so I live in a little place called Wildville. So it's in the county of about 50,000 people, but probably a less than 1,500 that live
Yep.
kind of right what I would consider who I would consider to be my neighbors. And but yeah, like most places around Nova Scotia are like that.
Yep.
5, 10,000 people. But yeah, right, kind of in downtown Wildville, you're probably only going to see a couple dozen people.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and that's one of the things that I think is really great about rural communities is you've got that, very small community that you might be a part of, but there is the whole region, which you talked about, right? And there's more, and
Totally.
you can get places very quickly in rural areas and some of those things. But there's the very smallest unit and then lots coming around it. And I think that's something for folks maybe who aren't from a rural community don't always understand that there's a lot around, and often in rural areas you think kind of about the whole region and all those things that are on offer. Um,
Yeah, that's right. And we live in a region. I don't just live in Wildville.
right.
I live on the South Shore of Nova Scotia, right? It's like I said, about 50,000 people, but we have some really unique towns and communities. Like, Lunenburg is probably the one that most people hear about the most from Nova Scotia. It's a UNESCO World Heritage District, so like really interesting architecture, and then a little place called Mahone Bay is like 700 people, but it's got this really kind of quaint small town feel to it. So we get to experience all of that, right? We're in the region that we call home.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing you mentioned is that you grew up in a different rural community and then came to this one. I don't know how old
Yeah.
you were when you came to this community. I think it sounds like you were married and maybe in adulthood or
Yeah, it was
approaching
in my
that.
university days,
Okay,
Burke,
yeah,
which
yeah.
was which I'll be dating myself if I say how long
That's
ago that
okay.
was. But yeah, I think I went back to Newfoundland for like after my first year of university for that summer, and then had stayed in Nova Scotia pretty much every year since. So
Yeah.
so yeah, so this is really where we call home now.
Absolutely. I'm curious what that process was like of we know oftentimes when you're in a rural community, the people you first notice are people who are returning to the rural community. But when you look at the data, a lot of the folks who are moving to a rural community are moving there without a previous connection themselves. They might have a spouse with
Yeah.
a connection or something else. But sometimes it can take a little bit of time to get settled in the rural community and find your feet. I'm curious, I mean, you're someone who has clearly found your feet in your community and well settled there. And like you say, it's really home for you now and has been for a while. I'm curious what that process was like, thinking back to when you were first arriving in a new rural community and getting settled.
Yeah. Well, I had one of the big advantages that you mentioned, right? So we live, our house is literally 10 minutes from the house that my wife grew up in down the road, and her mother is, that still lives in that house. All of her family is lives within 15 minutes of of where I'm sitting. So I had that sort of built-in community just by virtue of, the connection that she had here. This is where she grew up, and so it was very easy for me to, to integrate. And the job that I had when I first started working here was with a local not-for-profit called the Acadia Entrepreneurship Center, where I was like helping people start businesses. And so I was in that sort of economic development scene as well, and got to know just a ton of people really, really quickly. So that transition from eBirk was almost seamless. And you know, that being said, I also appreciate how, difficult it can be when people show up and they don't have those kinds of ties. And the advice I give those folks is just start getting involved in stuff, and without any real kind of expectations, without any real sort of like quote unquote agenda that you're trying to, but just to get familiar with the people and the things that are happening. And before you know it, you'll start to, to build those bonds and connections, and people will start to open up.
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely experienced that. Of a few years ago, I was moving to a small community of about 600 people for a job, and it was a temporary job. I was just helping out with something there for a little bit. But those first few days, it's like, oh, there's someone new in town, and you're kind of figuring it out. But
Yeah.
it's a small enough community, and you start getting involved with things. You start having conversations with people, and it's a lot easier to settle in and find your way, even if it can be intimidating at first,
Yeah.
I think.
And you
Um,
have to be intentional with
yeah.
about that. Like that has to be yeah, there has to be a level of intentionality around making those connections, because the blessing and curse of being in a rural place is that you can isolate yourself if you want to, or you can find a place where you never, and with, decent internet, you may bump into people having to go to the grocery store, but you could not engage at all. And I think if that's what you're looking for, great. But if you're looking to really take full advantage of the sense of community that gets built in real places, then you have to be intentional about making those connections and relationships, and make it a part of your routine, to yeah, just to be thoughtful around how you want to do that. And I think you get the most out of it that way.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I think that's one of the really cool things about rural communities is, on the one hand, in rural community, at certain times you can feel like, man, we're really far away from everyone else, but you can also feel I'm really close to everyone here. And
Yeah.
just kind of that, the way those two things go together can be really powerful.
Yeah, and I think one of your previous guests had this notion of like, and you're both in the middle of nowhere, but also in the middle of everywhere.
Yes.
So it's really about your perspective and how you choose to experience it. And I think that's the real beauty and advantage that you have in doing whatever it is you decide to do from a rural place, is that you get to make that choice.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I'm curious now to move into Work Evolved and the rural co-working spaces. Can
Yeah.
you talk a little bit about what these are? Who does Work Evolved serve? Like what? Yeah, let people know
Yeah,
what it is. Yeah.
a really eclectic group of people that find themselves in the small towns where we've set up these spaces, and are doing some really interesting things. And I really never set out, Burke, to like that, like Work of All was not a part of our business plan, right? We just kind of fell into it, simply because when I started Mashup Lab back in 2014, I really didn't have the need for sort of a permanent full-time office on my own, and but I also didn't just want to exclusively work from, my own little piece of paradise out in the woods. I knew that for me, that having that social interaction was going to be important. So just at a serendipity, I think I was like member number 5 or 6 at a new co-working space that had popped up in Mahone Bay, that small town of 700. And I'd never heard of co-working before. I never wasn't familiar with the concept. three guys from the UK had moved to Mahone Bay and they were working all at home. They're like, we want to work with around other people, entrepreneurial people doing entrepreneurial things, and we'll just get a space that's slightly bigger than what we need and invite more people to come work with us. And that's was my introduction to co-working, and just saw the power of the things that happen. I call it accelerated serendipity, right? So when two or three people simply decide to show up and work from that space on that day, it wasn't something that was in their calendar. They didn't intend to meet there, but all of a sudden they're in this conversation around, whatever it might be, the things that they're working on, the problems that somebody else is trying to solve, the things that they want to see happen in the community or to bring to the community, and just that sort of energy that forms around with those people really start to build those kinds of connections and relationships simply because they decide to show up and work from there that day. I think it's a really special kind of magic that happens in these places. But for some people, it's a really great remote work location. So they're working for a big, company somewhere else, but decide to set their lives up in a small town, and they can do that. We have lots of people that are working on their own startups and their own businesses that, that is their kind of, world headquarters is, their desk at my co-working space. And and then freelancers and people that are a part of this gig economy that may be working, part-time or a full-time job somewhere else, but then, doing something on the side in their spare time and want to be around that that energy of, like I said, entrepreneurial people doing entrepreneurial things. So that's what Work Evolved is. But I really sort of stumbled into it, ended up starting a co-working space in a neighboring community from the one that I was working from, end up buying that original co-working space and kind of bringing it all under the Work Evolved brand, and then ended up opening up another one about 40 minutes down the road from us because of a couple of community members there that said, "Hey, I think this could be a really great concept for our town as well." So that's in Liverpool, Nova Scotia. So yeah, they've been like they're not a big part of our business model, Burke. Like they're probably only represent 5% of our revenue and like 0% of our profit. But so it's not a huge part of kind of what we do as under the umbrella of Mashup Lab, but the impact that they have in those towns and in those communities and with that community of people that gather around that space is actually pretty important. So that's the reason I do it. That's the reason I continue to sort of invest time and energy into building them, and they represent something much bigger than just a part of part of the Mashup Lab sort of business units.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think that's awesome. And kind of the way it's organically grown out of, oh, we'd like one over here, and just kind of seeing the demand for it in some ways. And so I'm curious, I think for a lot of folks, they might be thinking, oh, it would be awesome to have a co-working space in my community, but we're a small community. How does that work? And so I'm curious for I
Yeah.
mean, you've got co-working spaces in small communities. I'm just curious for your perspective on like how does it work?
Yeah, and with a lot of like being really purposeful and intentional about what it is you're trying to build and create. So that co-working space that I started to work from, like I said, was in Mahone Bay. It's a town of 700 people. Yet, there was enough of those sorts of folks in both that community directly as well as in some of the neighboring towns to make it a viable thing. And it started out in a classroom in an old school that got decommissioned that was just offering up space. So they were like, yeah, let's just go for it. So it can happen as simple as that in a town as small as that, and even smaller. But I think the more important thing is not necessarily the size of the town. It's about, can we find enough of a core group of people to start to build the community around that space, whether it's in a town of 700, 7,000, or 70,000. I think that's the more important question to ask. Is like, who is out there that wants to be a part of helping us build this community? And the people that end up being members of my space, and again, we kind of bake this right into the recipe. A lot of them feel like it's just as much their space as it is mine. Like, yeah, I'm the owner and I pay the bills and all that kind of stuff, but it is just as much their space as it is my space. So when somebody new comes in, now I don't happen to be there, like I can't be at all of these locations all the time. They welcome them into the space and they say, "Oh, hey, Andrew's not here today, but I can help show you where the coffee machine is, and feel free to sit up in that desk." And so there's a sense of ownership that comes with the community building that I think is again, just it can happen naturally. I find that it's more important to be really purposeful with that, and having that as a part of like your things to do is like, what are we doing to intentionally build that sense of community around the space, regardless of what building it's in or what town it's in, or what size of the community it might be. Because that's really what's going to attract those people that find themselves there, whether it's just visiting for a week, to see friends and family, or moving their entire life to that little town, wherever it might be.
Yeah, I think one of the things you said there that really stuck out to me is kind of this concept of, you might think of a co-working space as just, well, this is a physical location where I can go to get some work done. But as you talked about, it's about the community aspect, right? And I mean, that's the thing when you hear people talk about what they love about a co-working space is who they ran into there, or who they made a connection with, and that sparked this whole other
Totally.
thing. I'm curious. You talked a little bit about being intentional about building that community. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that means to be intentional about the community and what that kind of looks like?
Yeah. Um, it's looked lots of different ways, like from a tactical standpoint, Berg.
Yeah.
Like we've just experimented with dozens of different things. Something as simple as a sandwich day. So I think it was, every Wednesday we send out a Google form to all the members and say, "Hey, we're going to organize a sandwich order at a local deli," and we set up a deal with that deli to make it like a flat fee of like $10 or something, or $15 or whatever the amount was. But again, it was just one of those sort of things that people really looked forward to. And when they get that Google form on Wednesday morning in their inbox, and they select their thing, and we go and we pick all the sandwiches up and we bring them and then invoice people for their 10 or $15. Like, it made 0 cents from a business standpoint. Like, the administration alone, to send out 10 or 15 $10 invoices was a bit of a pain sometimes. But it was so important as a part of like how people felt when they left that table at the end of that conversation, and the energy. And sometimes they have the most important conversation that week, right? And you know the one thing that they've been struggling to try and figure out all of a sudden got solved with 4 or 5 people sitting around the table in a matter of 20 minutes over a sandwich, right? So it's just like simple things like that I think um, can happen supernaturally, but happen a lot more quickly if you're intentional with them. And just like how we, give permission to people to welcome folks when they come in, and like um thank them for, hey, I heard that, so and so showed up today, and you kind of helped them figure something out. Like, we really appreciate that. So it's just those little things, but they end up being really important as a part of, building that momentum and that energy around the space, and then who that ends up attracting into the space.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I think that's awesome. Um, I'd like to talk a little bit about Mashup Lab now, and just kind of the overall idea here. So Mashup
Yeah,
Lab helps rural entrepreneurs start and grow their small businesses, helping to build the economy of rural communities. And there's something that you talked about that I want to key in on to start this
yeah,
conversation. I've heard you talk about how you used to work as an economic developer, and it felt like you were a mile wide and an inch deep. And Mashup Lab was your opportunity to go a mile deep in a really specific thing. And
yep.
obviously, there's really important work that economic developers do, but this is kind of your way to participate in that ecosystem. So I'm curious, what does it mean to go a mile deep with Mashup Lab?
Yeah, it means just doing like the real. I guess, problem and opportunity that I saw, Burke, when I was in my economic development role was we were doing so much to support small business and entrepreneurs in our communities. We had pitch competitions going on. We had our co-working spaces that were, creating that whole vibe. We had our local, what would be the equivalent of the, small business administration office giving out loans and offering programs. Our local community college was doing like entrepreneurship courses as well as opening up like makerspace on campus to help people like prototype. We had memorandums of understanding with some of the universities to bring research and academia to help businesses. Like just a mountain of things that were all designed and built to help people start and grow companies. And at the time, if you had come to me and said, "Hey, Andrew, I think all of this stuff is great, but I think there's this like massive pool of people sitting on the sidelines of that whole ecosystem, not plugging into all the awesome things that you're building, creating, and designing for them," like I probably would have ran you out of town. Like I would have been offended, right? Um, what I know now, Burke, is that I would have been absolutely wrong about that there was, in fact, a massive pool of untapped entrepreneurial talent sitting on the sidelines. And through a whole sequence of things that I won't bore you or your audience with the details of, but I began to realize that, wow, there are for nothing that we were doing wrong, nothing about what we were doing, how we were doing it necessarily. Um, but it just wasn't attracting a kind of entrepreneur that was in our ecosystem. And I just got like obsessively curious about that and wanted to just focus on that. And being in an economic development role, you just don't have the luxury of being able to zero in on that one thing. You've got a housing thing you got to deal with, and industrial park that needs care and attention, and a business retention expansion program that needs to get implemented, and a regional marketing thing, and then you got a tourism strategy that needs to be developed, and all of those things are really important. It's important to have people working on that stuff. But I was just like, this is where I feel I can have the biggest impact. It's just trying to figure out how do you get the attention of people that aren't paying attention to this stuff, and how do you get them off the sidelines and into that game? Because I felt if I could figure out that puzzle, then we could have a massive impact in some of these small towns and communities that we were working in. And once you had those people taking those first few steps onto that field, like a whole new world opened up to them. But they felt like all of that stuff was for something that wasn't them. And uh, and that's where Mashup Lab was born, you know, 11 years ago now. And it was in that space of like, I'm gonna go try to figure out that puzzle and see if we can um, better understand the things that we might be missing the mark on, that could unlock a whole other sort of level of potential in the places we call home. And that's where we started. So that's all we've been doing day in and day out for the last 11 years, just trying to get better at those two things: getting attention of people that don't tend to pay attention to this stuff, getting off the sidelines and into the game. And we've done that in 500 plus communities across both Canada and the US now over the last 10 years.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think that's so, I mean, what you're saying just resonates with me a lot of, you know, folks in economic development are working so hard. They're trying all these different things. And yeah, if you said to them, oh, people don't know about your programs or don't think the program is for them, they'd say, I'm trying so hard. I'm trying to get it out there. And so just making that connection so that people can understand, oh, sometimes, especially starting a small business, it can be, you can feel like you're on your own on it, right? You're starting things. And so finding those ways to connect with people is so important. And it's awesome that that's what you're doing. I'd love to talk about some of the specifics of what you do.
Yeah.
I think I pulled this from your website, talking about the unleashing the potential of rural places, and you talked about activation events, rural co-working spaces, and the virtual business incubator. So we
Yeah.
talked a bit about the co-working spaces, but on the activation events and the business incubator, I mean, what are those?
Yeah, so activation events is kind of where I would put Awesome South Shore, right?
Sure.
It's a monthly thing that we do. It's sort of a standing event that happens where it's really optimized to activate people with ideas. And again, we try to keep it super broad with the intention of catching all kinds of awesome things, portion of which are actually going to be entrepreneurial and small business ventures and things that are related to that. So those are the kinds of things that I kind of put in that bucket, and we do stuff online as well, and a few sort of um, things that end up sort of happening over the course of the year. But by far, Burke, the thing that's having the biggest impact is what we call our virtual business incubator. We describe it as that to our economic development friends. When we go to market it, we actually market it as our dream business program. And there's a real strategic reason why we call it something different with those two groups of people. Um, but it's a 6 week 100% virtual program. We get a group of usually anywhere from 15 to 20 entrepreneurs together online every week for those 6 weeks for 90 minutes, and help them, with really the one goal of trying to help people figure out if there's an awesome business to be built around this great idea that they have. And that great idea could be for like a brand new business and brand new idea. It could also be, for somebody that's been in business for 5 or 10 years, and the world's changed around them, but they have an idea to move that business and grow that business in a different direction with a new product or a new market, or a new thing. But the thing that sort of stitches all of those folks together, Burke, is really that they're all at this place of like, I have an idea for what I want to do next, but it's really different than anything I might have done in the past. It's a different business, a different business model. I'm not quite sure what that path really sort of looks like. And that's where we kind of help people quickly kind of navigate through those beginning stages, and again, help them get plugged into that local ecosystem of support, right? There's, as good as we've gotten at making 90-minute Zoom calls not feel like 90-minute Zoom calls, and creating that community online. In my mind, there's nothing that replaces the ability for somebody to call up somebody in their community and say, hey, can we go grab a coffee, and can we go chat about something that I'm working on. I think there's a real beautiful integration that can happen with this online virtual world, and real people in real communities in a real space.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, and that sounds like a great program. And I know many of our listeners are economic developers, and so they might appreciate a little peek behind the curtain here. You mentioned there's real
Yeah.
intentionality between the difference between calling it the virtual business incubator and the dream business program. And I mean, I can kind of get a sense of why that might be, but curious to hear kind of the reasoning for that and what it accomplishes.
Yeah, it's because in what we're learning is that there are more people that have a dream business, an idea for a dream business, than there are people that are searching for signing up for a virtual business incubator.
Yep.
Even though those are like, the process is exactly the same. And one of our biggest learnings is like the label that you put on things can really impact the kind of people that show up for that. And and I always had a sense of that, Bert, but I didn't realize like how drastic it could be. Like, I am literally the same guy I was when I was in my economic development roles, doing a lot of the same kinds of things, right? When you look at the actual, like, structure and technicalities, there's not a whole lot that's tremendously different from some of the things that we were doing in my economic development role. But what's extraordinarily different is the positioning of those things, the messaging of those things, the language associated with that, the channels through which we're marketing those things, the kind of partners that we're connecting with to help us go find those folks in those communities. Like, just a real practical example, like, we're running a cohort in Morinville, Alberta. It's a little sort of, well, not so little, a medium-sized town, I guess, just north of Edmonton. And they've been doing all kinds of cool stuff there over the last years. I think it was like 6 weeks ago, we started our process to go find people. We're now up to over 40 applications to fill those 15 spots in
Wow.
that community. Enough that we're going to end up running a second cohort there, right? We have enough people now to be able to do that. Well over 80% of those folks have never signed up for a business or entrepreneurship program ever before. right? So the channels through which we were messaging and marketing what it is that we're offering to a very specific kind of person that we were trying to connect with out there is really what makes really what makes the difference. And I think it's a part of our, I guess, our secret sauce is like we've figured out the things that end up working to find that untapped talent that might be sitting on the sidelines.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think about, I mean, calling it a dream business program. I think for many entrepreneurs, I'm curious if this rings true for you, they have a thing that they want to do, right? They have a dream, an idea. And so they might hear business incubator and they're like, well, I don't really want to learn how to run a business. I want to learn how to
Yeah,
like make this
I'm
thing I
not a
want to
tech
do a reality.
startup.
Yeah, yeah, exactly,
I'm
exactly. And I
not
think
tech. Yeah,
that dream business idea really capture. I would imagine it captures people to start thinking about, I do have this thing I want to do, and this could help me get there, you know?
yeah. And it's so like I could spend our entire time together just talking about this one thing because there's just so much we've been learning about this over this last decade. And sometimes um when people hear things like virtual business incubator, and that's the label we put on it as economic developers because that's what we understand, right? Like that gives us sort of the benchmark. But people build all kinds of assumptions around sort of what that means. And oh, I'm not a startup. I'm not a technology company. I'm not like I don't have some innovation. However, what's really interesting is sometimes when we go looking for people with a dream business, we find all of those things, right? So just a real quick example, we were running a cohort and just so happened that this one was based in Nova Scotia. And um, the business that the person that showed up was working on an ecotourism business. So they had this sort of plot of land in rural Nova Scotia, a beautiful piece of property, and they wanted to build these sort of off-grid bunkies where people could come and learn all kinds of like homesteading skills, and it was a part of this whole experience, right? Like, out in nature, away from the hustle and bustle. They, because of their location, they had a really hard time getting power to the off-grid bunkies. And there was a beautiful river that ran through the middle of the property, but all of like the off-the-shelf sort of power generation stuff that would they could put in the river just didn't work because of the site conditions and all that kind of stuff. So they ended up innovating a piece of technology that allowed to feed the bunkies. So all of a sudden, this like what would on the surface look like this sort of ecotourism business is all of a sudden a innovative energy startup, right? So a different they would never have thought of themselves as an innovative green tech company. Like that's not the label that they would have associated with, right? But that's exactly what we found in that company. And whether they decide to spin that out as its own business and whatever they choose to do with it, that opportunity is completely up to them. But sometimes we like unintentionally eliminate those people out of the process because of how what we go out looking for, and we just find lots of really interesting businesses that are hidden as other things, other kinds of businesses, and we just end up pulling that out of them as a part of the process, and then they get to choose, right? Do I do I want to build a ecotourism business and do that whole thing, or hey, does this other really interesting piece of technology present an opportunity I want to explore, and or can we spin that out and do a licensing deal? Like there's all kinds of again a whole world of options that opens up to people when they start to recognize that they might be a different thing than they think they are.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I think it's something that's just true of the, entrepreneurial spirit is when you're doing things, that's how you discover things, right? And so you
Yeah,
may have, once you start doing something, you might realize that, like you said, you discover a business within what you were doing that you couldn't have even imagined because you didn't know existed until you start doing things and you run into problems and you solve those problems. And then sometimes those solutions can lead to
yeah.
whole new things. But that's the exciting thing about bringing people into the entrepreneur ecosystem and getting them going on things because that's how you learn
Yeah.
is by doing.
And I just hold this belief, Berg, that like we have a lot of people that come through our program that end up making an extra 5 or 10 grand a year for their family, and they take them on a nice vacation somewhere. And that is awesome. Just as awesome as finding the company that ended up selling to the largest mobile video game company in the world for $350 million US. And we've had both of those things come through our process. So, but when you're in the context of a rural place, every single one of those entrepreneurial ventures, regardless of the size, has a ripple effect in terms of their sphere of influence, right? It's like their neighbors and their family that see them go to the farmers market and come home with a couple $1,000 cash in their pocket, the impact that has on their dreams and aspirations now. I think they're all of those things we need activated in rural places. And sometimes it's only the $350 million exit that gets the headline in the local newspaper. But all of those other things that happen, I think in my mind, are just as important as a part of the long game for rural communities. And I think a lot of those folks end up, being left on the sidelines sometimes because they don't necessarily see themselves in that story. And we go find those people, get them, activated and into the game.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm curious, um, you know, folks might not initially think of rural places as the first thing they think, or the first place they think about when they're thinking about where businesses start. But obviously, there are lots of amazing businesses that get started in rural communities, and that's not a surprise to either of us. But I'm curious, what's special about businesses and entrepreneurs that
Mm.
start in rural places?
Yeah, I think a lot about that question, and there's some practical things that make doing running a business in a small town a little different. I think the critical mass of people that you are surrounded by. You just don't have those sort of serendipitous collisions that happen when you're all concentrated in the city of, Sioux Falls, or what's the population of Sioux Falls? 150,
200,000, yeah,
180,000,
yeah.
200,000. Yeah, you just don't have that sort of critical mass of people that sort of just naturally run into each other. So whether that's finding workforce or finding investors or finding business partners or suppliers or those sorts of things, that becomes more challenging when you're doing this in a town of 1,500 people, and most of those people are working for one of the two or three big employers in the region, right? Um, so I think, and like logistics around getting product in and getting product out, I think there's some special and unique things about that. I think the bigger thing that makes being an entrepreneur, running a business in a small place, I think there's two parts to it. Number one is the connectedness to other people that get you and understand you and get what it is you're trying to do and why you're doing that versus just going to work for the big employer in town. Um, you just don't have that sort of critical mass of activity to find those people naturally. You just got to be really thoughtful about building out your own community of folks. And secondly is like the relationship you have with your community, right? Like being a business owner and an entrepreneur in a small town is a different thing. You don't get lost in the thousands of entrepreneurs and businesses and startups that you might exist in a bigger city. Like your kids are in on hockey teams and soccer teams and baseball teams with other people in town. There's a level of you people that are working with you and working with you in the business. Their lives are integrated and connected in the community, right? So you just um, have even though there's lots of space, sometimes there's less places to quote unquote hide. Like it's very visible. So I think the pressure sometimes that entrepreneurs feel as a part of that is like our wins are very sort of visible, but our losses are also very visible, very visible. And there's a certain level of risk that kind of comes along with us having to shut a business down in a rural place. Like that might mean I need to move my family out of town and move to the big city. Like the consequences sometimes of those choices can be feel a little heavier. So yeah, finding that sort of community people that really kind of get and understand that and surrounding yourself with those folks can be um, both unique and also extraordinarily important if you're doing this in a small town and in the middle of everywhere.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk a little bit about kind of the life cycle of a rural entrepreneur from start to finish. And we've got a few minutes left, so we'll move through this a little quickly. But I'm
Yeah.
curious, we've got a little bit of time. For rural entrepreneurs who are just getting started, what are some of the things they should be prepared for? And maybe you've got a success story or two, but and you touched on this a little bit. Let's break it out into the pieces. Yeah, what should rural entrepreneurs be ready for at the very beginning?
Yeah, like I don't again, I think there's a pretty well understood playbook in terms of like the technicalities of that, Bert.
Yep, yep.
I think the the thing that um that sometimes surprises folks when they're doing this in more of a rural place is like again being really intentional with finding that community of people, whether it's the 5 or 6 people in your town or a broader community online, but just surrounding yourself with other entrepreneurial people doing entrepreneurial things, in my mind, becomes more critical to success for somebody that's trying to do this in a small town versus somebody that might be, in a neighborhood of a, city of a, a couple hundred thousand people, right? It's just not going to happen as naturally and as organically as might be necessary. So just be really thoughtful and intentional about building out that community, finding those people, finding your tribe, and surrounding yourself with those folks because you're going to need them as you go through this, both in the good times and the bad times. Um, but from a like a business model standpoint, just really thinking about what are the impacts to certain parts of my business model that um, are a result of the choice I'm making to do this in a small town. So whether that's workforce recruitment, and maybe if I'm starting a company that requires a very specialized kind of expertise, like it's all figure outable, but that's going to be a more challenging thing for you to do in a town of 1,500 than it is in a city of 1.5 million, right? So just be prepared for that and just understand like this choice that you're making to do this in a small place. What are the the ramifications of that and the really important parts of your business model? Do you need access to certain markets? Are your customers in another part of the country, in another part of the world? Am I going to have to now figure out how I get to those markets? Right? There's another, sort of logistics around figuring all that kind of stuff out. So yeah, just be thoughtful around like what are the implications of the the choice I'm making to do this in this small place, and just sort of thinking all the way through that.
Absolutely. Um, for a lot of folks, I mean, they're starting a business so that they can run their business. And I think there's something that can be kind of unique about running a business or owning a business in a rural community. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you've seen as far as what it means to the community and to an entrepreneur to own and operate a business in a rural community.
Yeah, like I said, like I think there's a lot of opportunities that folks have where they could run and operate their business without any real connection to the community. Their employees are in other parts of the world. Their customers are in other parts of the world. As long as they got a decent internet connection, they might run and operate, a 6, 7 figure business, and their neighbors have absolutely no idea, right? Like you don't necessarily have to have um, that kind of connection. But for other kinds of businesses, yeah, it becomes a part of the community fabric. It's that business that moves into that empty space on Main Street. Or all of a sudden now my friend or my sister is working for somebody, right? That's like there's a connection there. And the degrees of separation between you and your business and the rest of the community become fewer and fewer. So those relationships that you have with people in the community become more and more important, whether that's other businesses or other young professionals or those relationships become the lifeline to your business in a lot of ways. And I think if you're not, again, being intentional and thoughtful about how you're building and fostering those relationships and nurturing those relationships, investing in those relationships, um, then you can figure it out, but it's a lot harder. And than just being a little bit thoughtful and intentional with that, with those sorts of things. Yeah, and just recognize that you're now part of that community fabric, and there's a level of responsibility that comes along with that that can be beautiful. And if you choose to make it beautiful, and I think there's a real opportunity there for folks that may not necessarily exist if you're just one of 10,000 people in a strip mall, some sort of like innovation or business park somewhere in the middle of a big city. It's those sorts of things can sometimes get you can just get lost in that. And I think there's a real opportunity to have a deeper sense of connection when you're doing these things in a smaller place.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Kind of building on that, thinking about, we mentioned earlier in the conversation that, some folks are looking to scale up a huge tech business and sell it. But we also have lots of folks who are, looking to start a business that they run in the community and they operate potentially until they retire or until the next idea comes along and they want to pass it along. And so I'm curious, just as folks think about, it's always good to be, I think, prepared for what's happening with your business. And so I'm curious if you've seen examples of people who've done a good job of being prepared for exiting their business, whether that's when they reach the time to retire or they're moving on to the next thing. How should people think about that throughout the process of owning and operating a rural business?
Yeah, so I think an important piece of that equation for people to think about is what is possible for a business that is started and run from a small place. Like, the possibilities of how big and how much of an impact that business can have and compete at a global level is been more accessible to folks now than has ever been in any time in our history. So don't necessarily close your mind off to the fact that you may have started this business to be just a really cool like lifestyle thing that makes you enough money to feed your kids and pay your mortgage and do all that stuff. But the possibility to grow that into something bigger, and at a global level is absolutely there. I've just seen it too many times not to believe it, Bert, right? To see these companies that just start out as a small thing and then turn into something that's massive. So just know that that's a possibility for you, and then you get to choose. Is like, is that the kind of company I want to build? Like, even though that opportunity might exist for me there, is that really what I want? And I think that's the essence of my message to people that are thinking through is like, just getting really clear about what it is you want. Like, what role is this business playing in the life you're trying to build for yourself, your family, your community? And again, is it something that's sustaining you and allows you to have a really great sort of quality of life in a place and get to enjoy living in a rural town? Great. Is it you feel like you have the opportunity to have a big impact on the world, and that's what that's the pursuit that you're on? Great, go do that. But just be thoughtful about what it is you actually want from this business and what this business, role it plays in the life you're trying to create for yourself in that rural place. And then you can figure out the technicalities of like how to make that happen and how to, at what point do you transition? At what point does it, grow and scale to a different level and all the things that kind of come along with it. But oftentimes people don't think about what they get into this thing, they start selling stuff, they start making money, but they hadn't actually thought about what is it that I actually want this to be. What's the life I'm trying to create? And I think spending a little bit of time in that space is probably helpful.
I think that's great advice. Well, Andrew, this has been just a fantastic conversation. I so appreciate you taking the time and sharing these great insights with our audience and with me. Is there anything else you wanted to make sure we touched on or mention before we finish up today? I just want to make sure if we left something uncovered.
Yeah, I don't think we left it uncovered, but the message I'll leave with folks is this is like this year we'll have run our 100th cohort of the Mashup Lab virtual business incubator. And every time we run at Burke, we find people sitting on the sidelines in the communities that we're running it that have extraordinarily amazing ideas for potential businesses in that community. And I believe there's a lot more places out there that have a ton of untapped talent. And if there's something that we can do and something that we're learning that can be helpful to people in those places trying to activate that untapped talent, then I'm more than happy to help. Whether that's running our virtual business incubator there or just sharing some of the things that we're learning about how we're doing it, I really encourage people to reach out and have that conversation. I'm more than happy to to be helpful in whatever way I can. So I really encourage folks that are listening, if there's anything that I've said that struck a chord, I'm sure you'll share my email, my LinkedIn, and all that
Absolutely.
stuff as a part of it. Feel like don't hesitate to reach out, and with zero sort of expectations around where that conversation might go. If there's something that we're doing that can be helpful to the work you're trying to move forward, I want to be helpful.
Awesome. I think that's a great place to close. Andrew Button, thank you very much.
Thanks for the invite. Enjoyed our conversation, Bert.